Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. In many cities around the world, the end of the road, so to speak, is in sight for cars. City officials want to reclaim the streets for pedestrians, for cyclists and for public transport. But how easy is it to go car-free? You're watching Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. From Oslo to Madrid to the ancient walls of York here in the United Kingdom, more and more cities are getting cars off their streets, fighting pollution and transforming the urban environment. It could well be a major contributor to reducing carbon emissions. For the latest in our series Net Zero, we're looking at car-free cities.
Cars have dominated city environments for most of the past century. But as their numbers soared, streets became clogged, journey times slowed, and neighbourhoods became polluted. So many city authorities worldwide are restricting car use to tackle climate change and overcrowding. Norway's capital Oslo is gradually becoming the first major European city without cars. Bristol is set to follow by 2021 and York in 2023. It's part of a global trend of reclaiming urban space to build more cycle lanes, better transport systems and pedestrianising city centres. But drivers' groups believe car-free initiatives are counterproductive, hitting businesses and services which rely on car and van deliveries. Will urban landscapes without a car in sight be the right solution for a carbon-neutral future?
Let us get all revved up. Joining us on the line from New York City, we've got Danny Harris, Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives. We move to Derbyshire here in the UK, where we say hello to Chris Rogers, Principal Investigator for Liveable, Cities out of the University of Birmingham. At the Roundtable, we have Christian Wolmar, an expert on the history of transport policy, who's written about it for the last 30 years at least, and Ian Taylor from the Alliance of British Drivers, who believes car-free initiatives are counterproductive. Feel free to join in any time you want, but since you're the man who loves cars, Ian, I'm going to start with you here. If you started all over again, you wouldn't invent cars, would you?
I probably would. Cars were invented anyway. When the first ones arrived, they were actually welcomed as a cleaner alternative to horse transport, which was getting, in London at least, pretty congested anyway. And, of course, horses have their own pollution problems.
But they don't kill people by dirtying the atmosphere. They don't clog up the streets quite so much. Cars, in the end, turned out to be a worse alternative.
In a few places where there were too many of them at the same time, I would say the further you get away from the middle of a really big city, the less of a problem they become. And indeed, the more people rely on them.
Danny, let me come to you. New York. Every time I've been there, it's gridlock. Have you got any solutions in a big city like that to getting cars off the streets that the rest of the world should know about?
I think New York, in some ways, is learning best practices from the rest of the world. We're hopefully on the cusp of congestion pricing. We're starting to take cars off of our streets. We're building out a protected bike network. A number of the things that you would see every day in London, Paris, Amsterdam, or Copenhagen. And at the same time, we're also exploring a series of new models. So we're exploring the future of freight. We're thinking about the future of our curbs. We're thinking about how to engage our waterways differently. Like most cities, we were built around water. And so I think, all cities like to think of themselves as unique. We just happen to be 8.6 million people struggling for a very small amount of space and really trying to push the envelope on new ideas and initiatives that can help our city thrive and give opportunity back to our residents.
What would happen if somebody said, next month, no cars, no vehicles, rather, are going to be allowed in New York City?
Well, I think we have to start with the reality, which is that our city and infrastructure was built around, after it was built around people and around horses, we then went through urban renewal and built ourselves around cars. So the truth is that tomorrow we could not shut off our city to cars because we do not have the public transit infrastructure or the freight infrastructure to meet our current demands. I think what we need to do is to create a better balance, and that's where I think you'll see the future of most cities headed, is that they give more space back to people and cyclists and public transit, and they take less space given to free parking and to congestion.
Chris, most of the major metropolitan cities, and Christian, you may have a thought on this one as well, most of the major metropolitan cities that have a reasonable public transport infrastructure could manage without cars, but they couldn't manage without vehicles because deliveries have to come into the city. Fair point or not?
Yeah, fair point. And of course, it's all to do with the way we have traditionally developed. This development has taken over hundreds of years in one sense. We had the canals, we had the railways, we moved to cars as a means of individual movement. And if we think about the affordances that other forms of movement provide, then it's quite true that we don't necessarily need to be individual in our movements. I think what we need to do is rethink the mobility in cities. I mean, cities rely upon people moving around, and individuals both want and need to move around. But if we were to rethink totally the way that we provided that facility in cities, then we might have a way of tracking back to where we are now and moving forward ultimately to a place where the privately owned motor car isn't needed. In fact, isn't wanted.
I will get your thoughts on that because you've been involved in consultations with some of the cities that are thinking of making themselves as car-free as possible. But Christian, let me bring you into this. You've been writing about transport for 30 plus years. You have lived in London all of this time. For 20 years, you've not used a car. I mean,
well, I use it occasionally outside. I do it in the centre, but not in the centre. I think that it's absolutely right that we don't really need cars, but there is the little problem of sort of democracy, right? I mean, if you were, if I was London's dictator, right, I would just say, right, you know, we only have taxis and buses in the central area, and everybody has to go around in buses, and for the last mile or two, they take a taxi home or something like that, right? So you have all the main arteries would just have buses and maybe the occasional taxi on them, ambulances, whatever, no private cars. And you know what? You probably have enough capacity on the buses because the buses would go so much faster that you wouldn't even need extra buses probably because they would manage to deliver so many people more quickly. But of course, you can't do that because there would be too much protest from the like of Mr.
But if
Taylor.
you're in charge of a city and you're looking at people's health, you're looking at well, I suppose that's the main thing. That
the
we're talking about
environment.
here.
I mean,
and the environment. Why couldn't you do that? Why couldn't you say to the people, sorry, actually, this is for the best? And I'll get your answer on this, Ian, in a minute.
Because there's too much vested interest in here. I mean, there's both sort of local vested interest. You know, people say, "Oh, I need to get my cars," and then there's this huge lobbying organisations that have been in favour of motoring. And really, this is a 100-year war, I think. And like ever since cars became prominent after the First World War, most of the legislation, most of the politicians have been in favour of encouraging car use. And it's only the last 20 or 30 years that we've begun to see a reversal of that process.
Isn't it about time you guys in your positions of influence, lobbying groups, as Christian said, realise that time is against you and health issues are against
I wish I was in a position of that sort of influence, I really do. But it once again comes back to what people want. If enough people didn't need cars, and they're not cheap things to run, they would probably choose to use alternatives. The fact is, people vote with their money to use cars most of the time. Now, it does depend where they are. I will grant you the situation in the middle of somewhere like London or even one or two other big cities is an entirely different matter to elsewhere in the country.
But that's because they've been given no other choice. I mean, if you live in relatively rural areas, they've done away with all the local buses and stuff. Even if you live in some suburbs, the bus service is so poor that you have to have a car. But, I mean, America in particular is very interesting in this respect because New York is completely different from anywhere else. There are quite a lot of people who don't own cars in New York. But if you live in some small town in Ohio or somewhere where there is virtually no public transport, you have to have a car. And it's not because people want to spend all their money on a car. They're actually, if they have to work or whatever, they will need their car. So it's not a choice.
Let's get
That's
Danny's
true.
view on this in New York. Back to you in just a moment. But I was going to say, I mean, is that true that in New York, relatively few people have their own car and therefore they could do without it anyway? Or what was it you wanted to say?
Well, David, there are 8.6 million residents in New York, 7 million of whom do not own a car, do not. And again, our decisions are made around the 1.7 million who do and the power that they wield. And, we have 6,000 miles of road and 3 million free parking spots, and our sidewalks are covered in garbage. And so, in essence, we're giving away the best real estate in this city to detritus. And so I guess what I want to come back to is really, I think as advocates and in this conversation, I think it's important to actually look at the industry and what they're telegraphing. And right now you have, the big American auto manufacturers are producing 80% plus of their entire fleet is focused on SUVs and light trucks. And clearly that's making our roads more dangerous. It's putting more people in debt. But if you think where the companies are headed, in essence, they're going to be competing with the likes of Amazon and Apple and IBM, and they're all trying to get into the new mobility space, which is about data, it's about mobility as a service, and it's about new mobility options. I think while most of us are and remain addicted to automobiles, the truth is that the big automakers are going to start to move away in the next 20 years or so, not just from automated vehicles. That's one piece of it. But the other is they realize that this dependency on cars is not going to be forever.
Okay.
So the reality is,
Chris, I'll come to you in just a moment, but I want to put that back to Ian here. I mean, the suggestion is that while car users and car lobbyists, and you are a lobbyist,
Yes,
are in the pockets, if you like, of the big auto manufacturers, you're not going to get car-free cities.
I'm not in anyone's pocket. It would be nice if I was in somebody's.
Okay, you feel the pressure from.
Okay. What I don't like is the idea that you dictate to people what they cannot do.
But that is what society does. It's called the rule of law, and society makes certain decisions that are deemed to be for the benefit of the majority, and then certain people are told they cannot do things. It's simply that, isn't it?
That is true. It's not that simple if a majority of the people want to do something and are being told they can't. So, once again, I would like to see, I don't deny there's a congestion and pollution problems in our cities, especially, well, probably London more than anywhere else in this country. But I would like there to be a more positive ideas and solutions put forward. And we'll go back to the horse-drawn age again just for a moment, if I may. The Victorians had their problems with congestion as well. They didn't ban the horse traffic. They started building and invented what became the London Underground instead. And I would like to see innovative solutions that give us brand new alternatives.
Okay, let's go to Chris. I was holding you back just a little bit on this because you put forward suggestions to cities that want to look into this and take it seriously. What is the way of getting cities to be car-free without upsetting, as Ian says, a large number, maybe a majority of people?
It's all to do with the offering, isn't it? I mean, so we do want to move around. We aspire to move around freely. We love the freedom of the open road. Tell me what the freedom of the open road looks like in Birmingham or Liverpool or London at 8:30 in the morning. And what we don't want to do is be held up in traffic jams. We don't want the unnecessary pollution that goes with that. We don't want our journey times to be uncertain. So what we have to do, I think, is create a vision for the future in which people can move unrestricted, they can move affordably. What we really ought to be doing is looking at some sort of just and equitable system. So, I mean, I could put to you a proposition, and that proposition around, let us say, interconnected green corridors, seamlessly linked with pervasive public transport, made free at point of use. The need then to use cars in cities would, I think, largely disappear. You would probably restrict, as in you would not wish cars to come into cities during working hours, but then you wouldn't want to. And the cars have a role to play in everywhere but cities. And so it's not a question of removing the car or the use of the car, but it's just removing it from a place where essentially we don't want it.
Okay, so tell us, this is your vision, but tell us about how difficult it is for cities to move towards that at the moment.
Yes, it's a political challenge, but politicians are put into power because the people vote them there. So what we really need to know is, what are the aspirations of all of those road users? What do they, if you were to ask them what they wanted, I'm absolutely certain they would not want to be stuck in traffic jams. What they would want is the facility for mobility that is affordable. If you asked industry, I'm quite convinced all of the industries would say what they want is for people to be able to move around and not feel restricted. So if we then looked at the aspirations of all of those actors in this space, and then understood how we might then bring ingenuity to this particular challenge. I mean, I'm an engineer, and the root of the word engineer is in ingenuity. What we do is we create ingenious solutions. So what we would then do is look at a way of providing that type of facility, the ability to move. And if we wanted to move into human rights, or we wanted to move into the collective aspirations of a nation, what we might find is, well, there should be a right to move around, because that delivers productivity, it delivers health and well-being, it delivers all of the other aspects of civilized life that we ultimately aspire to. So what we might then do is to say, in that case, we should provide our taxes through the government to fund this type of mobility that would benefit everyone.
But you see, sorry, Chris.
The trouble is that we've had 100 years of moving in precisely opposite direction, and we also have politicians who very often don't have the courage to push through policy, even mildly car restrictive policies, like even closing off a particular street. There can be a fantastic row over just closing off a street, or building a cycle lane. You only have to look at the battles over the cycle lanes in London, or the battles over the Oxford Street, where Oxford Street, it is mad that there are cars in Oxford Street. It is one of the world's premier shopping streets.
But when I went into the streets behind, at the height of this, people were objecting to the fact it was being pedestrianised because cars would come past their front door.
Yeah, but they wouldn't particularly. They'll dissipate.
But isn't this the point? That you're not going to please everybody in this.
No, you're not. Sorry, they want to.
I just, maybe if I can add a bit of reality. I just got news now that a 10-year-old was just killed in East New York by a car. This happens every day in our cities, and we know that the numbers are 1.25 million who are killed every year, and the vast majority of those are actually children under the age of 13. So I think it's important that we can have a philosophical conversation about what actually moves people forward. But the reality is that people are dying every day on our streets. In America, it's 100 people a day, and cars are getting bigger, drivers are having more distraction.
I have to say, Danny, and I think it's terrible that this is happening, but you could argue that about pretty much every means of transport.
No, not at all.
There are dangers.
40,000 people a year get killed in America, and as he says, the cars are getting bigger. They're killing more people. The numbers are actually going up, and this is entirely preventable. Helsinki, a big capital city, had no road deaths in 2019.
How did it do that?
And they did that. They changed from a 30-mile-an-hour limit to a 20-mile-an-hour limit, essentially. They had all sorts of other measures. They looked at where every accident happened and what can we do about that. They essentially slowed the traffic down, and nobody was killed in a big city like Helsinki.
Okay, so the answer is not necessarily getting cars off the streets, it's just controlling cars a little bit more. Danny, answer that one, then I'll come to Ian on that.
Yeah, David, look, I think the answer is that, all of us are due to make mistakes. So I'm a stroller parent, and I walk with young children, I ride a bike, I have parents who want to age in place. All of us should be afforded the ability to make a mistake and not be killed by an SUV or a garbage truck or whatever it is. The reality is that our street design is built now such that A small mistake by a pedestrian or a cyclist can mean death or serious injury. When you look at Oslo and Helsinki and Copenhagen, they build in for the possibility that people are imperfect, and as are drivers. And if you do make a mistake, it just means that the implications are not as significant.
Ian, you know you're not here to defend the indefensible because road deaths are indefensible in so many ways. You are here simply because you think that the restrictions would be a bit too much. And I did not mean to suggest earlier on that you were actually sort of being used by the big motor manufacturers, but you represent their interests as well because you like cars so much. But what did you want to say to Danny?
That could be said. Several points have just come up, I would say. As far as people not needing or wanting to use their cars, there may be some people that actually live in the cities might disagree with that, as opposed to those who come in and go out to go to work. The fact that you'd like to lessen the amount of traffic at times in certain places, well, yes, nobody likes being stuck in traffic. I certainly don't. But to just say, therefore, we've got to start banning traffic is surely... It's the equivalent of saying, oh, look, that railway line's crowded. Everyone's coming in to commute at the same time every morning. We shouldn't be putting extra trains on to cater for them. We should actually not put peak services on, and people will only be able to travel as much as those trains are there. Imagine the uproar if you said that.
OK, this programme is about net zero. So, Chris, I wanted to come to you and say... looking at the cities as you do in some detail, are we ever going to get to a state, or will we relatively soon get to a state where we can say something is being achieved towards that target?
If you are the eternal optimist, you could argue, yes, we have it within our grasp. You talk about the reluctance to move from where we are to where we might go. And there is a reluctance in part because we do not understand the full implications or the consequences, the full range of benefits that might be brought into play if we were to radically change the way we moved around our cities. And so we could set ourselves a goal of net zero and say that we're doing this precisely because of net zero. But what you might then say is, yes, but that's just one of the benefits that we could bring to this. We could also bring justice to and equity to the system of moving around cities. We could bring affordability. We could bring health and well-being. The well-being that one now gets, for me, in London, when I go down to London, I don't now, in fact, use the tube. Because I have a city mapper app, I can plot my way through London, and I don't feel constrained to move the tube. But I walk now through London, and when I get to my destination, which is typically the Institution of Civil Engineers in Westminster, I have a 45-minute walk. My well-being quotient is so very much better than it ever was when going on the tube.
I suppose it all depends what the air quality is like. And one thing we haven't mentioned, can I just raise this, because we've only got a couple of minutes, is the economic side of this, because fewer cars means less trade.
No, absolutely. There is an economic side, but I think there's a well-being side which is underestimated, which is that look at Holland, where, you know, the kids of 8 years old cycle on their own to school safely. Right. Now, think what that does for the independence of kids, the health of kids, and the air quality generally. It's absolutely transformational, and we can work towards that. I mean, again, make me, you know, transport czar, and I'll create a network of, you know, Holland has 35,000 kilometres of cycle track. You know, I mean, that's just extraordinary, and it makes for a totally different culture. And the fact that cars have dominated our world for the last 100 years is a real detriment to a lot of people's lives.
OK, and taking cars off the road, final word probably, would actually be better for people's health, wouldn't it?
I don't necessarily think so. There's not a lot of evidence to say that. Also, of course, if people want to use their cars, they should be able to. And also, I would say that, yes, traffic does bring its problems. Nothing in this world is problem-free. But nobody ever goes into the way they've changed our life for the better on the other side of that balance sheet.
OK, Danny, I think we have a minute or so. So I saw you looking slightly exasperated at that last comment. So you may say what you want to say, and then we're going to have to say goodbye.
Yeah, with respect to Ian, that cannot be the last word on this conversation. We know there's infinite number of facts that show that car dependence locks people into endless poverty. It has significant impact on public health.
Chris, it's got to be pretty much a 1 or 2 word answer. Will we see car-free cities within the next 20, 30 years?
Yes, I believe so. The younger cohorts of people in cities that we have interviewed have no interest in a car other than being able to get around. And I think if we provide the affordances that the car has without the private car being a necessary thing to own, then I think in cities that will happen. And cars will be used elsewhere and people will like to drive them elsewhere.
I should know, I've been doing this long enough. When you say a 1 or 2 word answer, you are never, ever going to get a 1 or 2 word answer when you're working to a timed programme. And we have arrived at our destination. Thank you very much to everybody. Danny, sorry we lost the last few words that you said, but we got the drift of it all. And thank you very much indeed. I should point out that you came in today on the train.
That is true.
Thank you very much indeed. Chris, appreciate your time and thank you very much for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from my guests and from the team that made it possible. Goodbye for now. Hope to have your company on another occasion. Ta-ra.